You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Hey guys, this is your host Josh Lewis, and in this episode I have a conversation with Arizona State University political philosophy professor John von Heyking. John specializes in civic education with a focus on the friendship of politics. John himself is actually Canadian. Yet in spite of this handicap, I think it'll be evident in the conversation, he knows American civic ideas and education very well. And who better than a Canadian to introduce this idea of friendship into politics? Or as he jokingly puts it, as a foreigner working here in the United States, he's doing the work that Americans themselves don't do, teaching civic education. I did want to mention briefly for those interested, many of these podcast episodes are now available in transcript. You can read them rather than just listen to them. I will include a link in the notes where you can go to find that. It might take a day or two before some of these transcripts get uploaded after the episode drops. But if you're the kind of person who would prefer to read these conversations I have with these wonderful guests, check out the link in the show notes. So with that, I give you my conversation with John von Heyking.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
John, I want to ask you right off the bat about the politics of friendship, part of your work and your study, because I dare say that if people were to put attributes or adjectives upon the word politics these days, friendship is pretty far down on the list of how we would describe this. So what is the politics of friendship?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess if you kind of refer to the classical thinkers, writers like Plato and Aristotle, friendship is the aim of politics. It's not just sort of a thing that happens incidentally, but is something that's sort of at the core of what politics aims at and what political activity does. And as you rightly point out, it's hard to see any evidence of that today. So I'll just use one example, the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence has the very noble words of, we hold these truths to be self-evident, right? And that is an example, I think, of what Aristotle would call civic friendship, which is, he uses the Greek term is homonoia, which usually gets translated as like-mindedness. But it's an agreement on sort of the fundamental things that a political community affirms. And, he's got a little bit more to say, but that's kind of the main idea. And to my knowledge, despite all the partisan strife and so-called polarization, I don't see any evidence of Americans disagreeing over that self-evident truth. It's still self-evident to Americans. Where the fighting starts, or not fighting, I should be careful with my words, but where the disagreement comes and the contentiousness comes is how that gets played out. And that's just called politics, right? That's just called debate. That's called deliberation. And so the fundamental proposition of the regime, I think, is as true today as it was 250 years ago. And I think it does kind of fulfill what Aristotle and the Greeks would call political friendship.
The first thing that comes to my mind when we're talking about Aristotle and the Greeks, of course, is I think it'd be fair to say they conceptualized the political order not as a 350 plus million populous nation state.
Yeah.
It was a city state. It was Athens. It was Sparta. And so is there a scalability problem here where their conceptions of civic friendship just cannot translate to our current modern political structure?
Well, that was at the very heart of the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists.
Right.
The Anti-Federalists, you could argue, were a little bit closer to that kind of classical understanding, right? They were worried about bigness, or what Madison called the extended republic. And they thought, you'd lose it, right? If you went big, you just end up with a tyrannical large empire, and you lose the self-governing nature of the states and the local politics. And that sort of has a little closer to the Greek understanding. And then, you read the Federalist Papers, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, they walk very gingerly around that question, right? I mean, they're usually read as sort of dismissing that kind of classical understanding that it's not like-mindedness or homonoia. It's, ambition counteracting ambition. It's separation of powers. So their argument seems to be create a federal government that is extremely limited, that doesn't really appeal to your hearts so much, but more to your kind of instrumental self-interests, and away you go. I mean, I think some people read the Federalist sort of rhetorically in that sense, that they knew that if they were to try to make an argument along the lines of a political friendship on the extended scale of the national scale, the Constitution never would have been ratified, actually. So they wanted to emphasize how non-threatening, you might say, the federal government would be. You can keep your, as we say today, you can keep your healthcare plan, you can keep your state, you can keep your little polis. But I think as it's worked out, whether through subsequent reformulations of justifying the national government and sort of the American Republic, think of Abraham Lincoln, right? We are not enemies, we are friends. Right. And, Abraham Lincoln sort of reinvents what it means to be American, but you could kind of see the seeds already in the Declaration, and even like George Washington, for example. So I think, the sort of the scalability question is a problem, but I think it seems to hold. I think it holds. One of your previous guests, Yuval Levin, wrote this wonderful book, American Covenant. And he's actually one of the few people to make this argument that what America is. I mean, think of the language of the title, covenant, right? Covenant is more than simply a transaction. It is, when people get married, they make a covenant, right? It's also biblical language. And so, I mean, he actually makes an explicit case that what America is a kind of like-mindedness in this Aristotelian sense. He even cites Aristotle and some scholars who sort of see some affinities. So I guess the long and the short of it is that the sort of the ancient understanding of politics as friendship, it's not an argument for we're a small group, we know each other really well, we really like each other. I mean, that would be great, but it is a lot less sort of intimate, maybe more minimalistic than it first appears. And I think it's understanding it that way helps us understand. I mean, Aristotle is quite explicit. The association that is the polis. He's trying to figure out what is this. Is it like the family? Is it like the the economy? He kind of dismisses these. It's not a treaty, right? It's not a sort of transaction, right? It's something more than that. I mean, you can have a treaty with an enemy power. You can have an alliance. America can have an alliance with the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany. You never call Soviet Union your friend, right? You never call them fellow citizens.
I mean, some of the progressives did.
Well, yeah.
They were mistaken.
So that gets into factionalism. So Aristotle. I mean, sort of Aristotle against a certain kind of liberalism might say a political association is not an alliance. It's something more. And I think that's very much true of the American case and liberal democracy in general.
I know this is a unsettled and perhaps unsettable, if that's even a word, something that cannot be settled, we'll say, issue of what precisely is the kernel around which we can define America. And I don't mean that we can't put a lot of words out there that make a lot of sense. I think in a lot of ways, you rightly point to Abraham Lincoln. I think we Americans are living in the shadow of Lincoln and his, in my view, correct reintroduction, if you will, of the Declaration of Independence as these propositions that hold us together, knit us as a nation. And it I don't want to oversimplify things, but it kind of seems to me that there's a sort of sliding scale. The smaller the nation state, the I won't say the easier, but perhaps the broader the things are you can identify that unite this sort of magnanimity or this civic union or friendship, right? I've heard it said before that, is in spite of the fact that Greece was the birthplace of Western civilization, it's not as if Greek city-states were just bastions of liberal, libertine freedom and individual expression, right? You didn't have your Southern Baptists and your Catholics and your atheists and Hindus and everybody else running around. They were pretty uniform in a lot of their cultural expressions and views. I mean, heck, they killed Socrates for some of his waywardness. But as you expand the nation state, it becomes necessary, and sometimes nation states find ways to do it. Well, we'll base this off ethnicity, or we'll base it off of shared history, or we'll base it off of custom, or we'll base it off of religious expression. And it seemed like here in the United States, we have tried to varying degrees of success to base it off of Abraham Lincoln's interpretation of what the founders were up to. This, I guess, sort of leads to my mind, are there natural limits to this? Like, is it because oftentimes when I'm talking to my conservative friends who are, let's say, more pessimistic than I am, which is difficult to find, but they do exist, they will express in such a way of, well, we cannot interact in these compacts with, say, capital L left, because it is destructive to the very fabric of American ideas of understanding of equality and liberty. And that therefore it becomes almost a zero-sum game of might makes right, of we have to wrestle political control from them. We cannot make, we can't, I mean, heck, we even see Donald Trump say this, now that Iran's been nullified, the next great Satan is the American left, like the American citizens.
Oh my gosh.
And I am opposed to the American left, but I think that there is
Yeah.
a sort of mindset that says we cannot see them as fellow citizens who are mistaken. Rather, they are the enemy, the cancer to be destroyed.
Yeah. Well, that kind of reminds me, I think it was the famous story of the tears that were shed when Rome finally destroyed Carthage. Right? Carthago delenda est. Carthage is destroyed. I think it was Cato who announced that, but he did it with tears. It was lamentable because, his argument was Rome needs an external enemy, and without one, it gets weak and then sort of cannibalizes itself. And I don't know if that's really somewhere you want to go in America. Because what that says is that there's really nothing holding it together, just you need an external enemy. And if not an external, then an internal will do. And I don't think that's really where you want to go. And that's certainly not where Lincoln wanted to go.
No.
I mean, he had an internal enemy. He had a real one, right? And I suppose that sort of gets to maybe the nub of the question. Right. I mean, you see certain fringe elements in the left who want to say, the Constitution's no good, but they usually frame it in such a way that it has to be, progressively improved, whether through amendment. But I mean, I actually don't see too many serious debates these days, right or left, on amending the Constitution, never mind overthrowing it. So, I mean, I suppose if you're going to be looking for enemies, it should be, okay, does anybody want to, realistically and effectively overthrow the Constitution? I mean, I don't know how you could do that in America. It just seems to be such a ludicrous proposition, even. So, whatever poisonous and kind of critical theory poisons are brewing around the left in America, unless we're talking about armed resistance, I'm not sure if it's really all that serious. I'm probably naive, or maybe I'm naive on that. And I think the undercurrent of some of this too is that, I mean, the America of the founding and America of Lincoln is not the same. The constitutional assumptions have kind of changed a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of language and debate over the last 10 or 15 years over, deep state, administrative state. And I think what that expresses is a kind of lament, maybe, of a loss of popular control over the political process. Politics gets centralized. Federalism isn't as important. The big decisions, many decisions are now kind of at the national level. Even Congress is sort of a shadow of its former self. Everything is kind of run under the executive office of the presidency, the bureaucratization of politics. And in that sense, the left, I think, tends not to see that as a big of a problem, largely because the people who staff these administrative offices, whether in government or the university, there's a whole ecosystem, they tend to be on the left. And so they see their function, they see politics as a way of, you need these administrative institutions to control the people, because the people are they're rubes, they're uneducated, and they kind of give you a twisted version of James Madison, right? James Madison says ambition counteracting ambition. So you need bureaucrats and administration to control the ambitions of the people, but they never get around to realizing that Madison would want the bureaucrats to be controlled too, right? So, I mean, that's kind of their blind spot. I mean, the right has its own blind spots, but I think that kind of appeal towards technocracy and these sorts of things on the left is sort of their blind spot. It is a kind of, if only we could sort of get away from partisan politics and have our politics guided by enlightened, benevolent leaders, Platonic guardians, this sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a kind of move away from the kind of political pluralism and contentiousness that a Madisonian pluralistic polity actually entails. I mean, Levin is outstanding in this regard, right? Politics, the way the Constitution in America is set up, is that you actually need, on a perpetual basis, to build and sustain coalitions.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have a coalition, then you're not going to get anything done. And that's why, for example, Congress is kind of a shadow of its former self, because they don't bother getting anything done. The hard work of building those coalitions is just not being done. So you end up having government by executive decrees on the presidential side, which can be easily reversed by the next president. And I suppose that kind of gets around to the initial point you made about the extended republic and bigness. I mean, Madison's argument, which I think kind of still holds, although it's sort of distorted, is that the virtue of the extended republic is that it's really hard to get permanent majorities, right? It's a pluralistic public sphere of multiple minorities, whether minorities based on property, of region, of, today, gender, whatever. And if everybody's a minority, that kind of has a moderating effect, because it realizes, well, on issue A, I have to make a alliance with you or a coalition with you. On issue B, I have to make a coalition with this other side. And if I'm really nasty to people, no one's going to like me, right? No one's going to want to sort of make a coalition with me. So it's in my interest. I have an incentive in this Madisonian structure to at least be moderate. We don't have to like each other, but we need to be able to work with one another. And of course, that's kind of what political friendship's about. It'd be nice if we like each other, but better, can we work with one another? Because after all, we're engaged in the same project. We're fellow citizens.
I congratulate you for saying all that so well without mentioning the name of Madison's antithesis, of course, as Yuval then does Woodrow Wilson, in kind of the improved bureaucratic model. I mean, I don't want to lay at his feet all of progressivism, but I think he's probably rightly understood as sort of the godfather in a lot of ways of opening that Pandora's box of allowing a view I think you hear very often of kind of a notion of why can't we have a more simple, direct majoritarian model, or at least it seems to be an underlying longing that, well, if this is what the people want, surely we could just elect people to represent them, and why do we have to fool with this whole business of enduring coalitions? It seems anti-democratic.
Yeah, and Wilson draws a lot of that argument from how he understands the English Constitution, right? He kind of sees the English Constitution, he sees the Prime Minister as this strong leader figure who can hold together majorities, which I think, I mean, he seems to get some of that from Walter Bagehot, who wrote this book in 1867. Started as articles, but is published as a book in 1867, The English Constitution. And the main virtue I think Woodrow Wilson saw in the English Constitution was that rather than separation of powers, which he saw as too weak, you have what Bagehot called a fusion. So a fusion of executive and legislative, which can be seen as executive control is probably too strong a word, but executive guidance of the legislature, right? So, for example, in Westminster systems like Canada or Great Britain or Australia or New Zealand, with varying degrees, a prime minister can kind of have control over a caucus to make sure that the government continues its life and does not lose any confidence votes, because if you lose a confidence vote, if the House of Commons loses confidence, then you go to election, right? That's actually the check in the system. Bagehot thought it actually provided better checks than the American system, but that's for another day. But the problem that Woodrow Wilson gets into is that he thought he could just kind of import these British parliamentary practices into the American system without, I think, fully appreciating that when you do that, you start screwing stuff up, right? It's like if you have a domestic car and you need parts, you bring in parts from other, that just aren't meant for this car.
Mm-hmm.
What happens? It doesn't work very well. And I think that's kind of a way of thinking about Woodrow Wilson's progressivism. I think he was, he's an intellectual, he's a political scientist, right? So they don't understand practical consequences and unintended consequences. They just have their theories, right? So he looks at this British theory, such as it is, and said, well, that looks good. Let's import it, without really realizing that if you import it and put these different tools or different things into the American Constitution, your car is going to stall. Your Constitution's not going to work very well. I mean, you see stuff in the opposite direction in Canada, for example. So in Canada, you have term sort of fixed election dates, which the British Constitution doesn't have that. But Canada's imported from America the notion of fixed election dates, right? So, every 4 years, the president's up, this sort of stuff.
Right.
And so every 4 years, but nobody actually follows it, at least not consistently in Canada. They have these laws as a way of saying, hey, look, we're accountable. We don't want to appear to be too, we want to be responsive to the public weal. So every 4 years is going to be an election. But I don't have numbers, but it's ignored, right? Because it's just law. But under the Canadian Constitution, what the Canadian Constitution says, and that follows British practice, is that you have to have an election at least every 5 years. So you have this Constitution that says at least every 5 years, and then you have statute that says fixed elections every 4 years. Well, guess what? You're going to ignore the lower one and just go with the higher one because it makes sense within the system.
Yeah. I'm impressed, I guess, by the degree to which, I don't know sometimes if we humans gravitate towards certain political ideologies or worldviews based off of something in our DNA or bloodstream where I think conservatives tend to be individuals or I don't say pessimistic, but genuinely surprised when the world goes better than they were expecting. Progressives seem to be those who are more upset that it isn't better than it is. And neither of these are good or bad in and of themselves. Just you can build more complex worldviews off of them. And I think that one of the natures of the progressive is kind of a notion, as the word itself suggests, that we humans have the capacity and ability and obligation to progress, to do something better today than what maybe our ancestors did. And that, because Wilson, if I'm not mistaken, he didn't reject the founders in the sense that he thought they were wrong for their time and place, but it was almost they were borrowing a Newtonian model. But it doesn't make sense in our present circumstance with the complexity of the United States and its role in the world for us to be having all these parts fighting against each other. Why would you have separations of powers? It's like having a human body where all the organs are fighting against each other. A new and improved model, as good as that was for its time, and we congratulate them for that, but we know better now, and we've progressed beyond this. And we see this throughout all kinds of conservative versus progressive kind of ways of looking at things. But one of the ways, of course, is friendship, where I think there has been forgive the ham-fisted, long-winded segue back to friendship. But it occurred to me that there's as I had forewarned you before we recorded, that the majority, unfortunately, my understanding of civic friendship comes from C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves. And he talks about a departure from the way the classics, or I guess as he would have put it, the ancient and the medieval periods viewed friendship versus our more modern era. He blames it on romanticism. And I'm probably going to butcher it, but in my extremely brief summation, he said, look, the ancients saw this as almost godlike because unlike, we need eros to survive. We need the erotic love to perpetuate as a species. We need affection to have the capacity to rear children. These things are necessary. They're also attached to nature. You can observe these in animals and the brutes, I think he says. But friendship is a little distinct from that. It's not as instinctual. It's not an immediate gut reaction. It doesn't ting our emotions or sentiments as much. And so therefore, the ancients almost saw this as more godlike. It was something that transcends our natural brute instincts. And this is, of course, almost backwards from the way we moderns think of friendship, as it's the lesser love, if you will. We don't write songs about friendship. We write songs about romantic love. So I want to invite you. There's a lot there, but if you just comment on, is that true that we view friendship different? And if so, was Lewis right that it was the romantics that got us screwed up?
I think in a general sense, he's probably right. I think it was William Butler Yeats who said that friendship is love without wings, which just is a nice crystallization of the romantic view. So all the excitement, all the passion is with eros, erotic desire. Friendship is more mundane, right? Unlike Lewis, there's not even a connection with the divine with friendship, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right. It's just kind of mundane. So I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Yeah, I mean, how the Greeks understood the difference between eros, which is erotic desire, and friendship, which is usually how we translate the Greek word philia. Yeah, there's a lot to say there. I mean, I would disagree with at least that statement by Lewis that eros is only about sexual desire and perpetuation of the species. I mean, you just looked at something like Plato's Symposium, where he kind of starts that, but it rises up to the divine. So Plato kind of treats eros as a ladder of love that rises to the divine. And so, I mean, some people feel erotic desire and express it, as we would say, romantically, or through the begetting of children. Begetting is a very important symbol for Plato, but it goes all the way up to the divine. It's a philosophical experience. Aristotle, who gives us the sort of most systematic account of friendship in the ancient world, he says at one point that friendship is most intense and best. I mean, Aristotle actually doesn't say much about eros, maybe on purpose, but he does see friendship or philia as that which, I mean, he kind of ends up in the same place that Socrates does by treating eros as the ladder of the divine. At the very peak, it's almost eros and philia for Aristotle end up being the same, right? Because you have a love of wisdom, but your love of wisdom is instantiated with a love of your friend with whom you share this life project of seeking wisdom, whether it's purely through contemplation or simply a life lived together. So Aristotle has this great comment in the Ethics near the end of his discussion of friendship, where he says that it is the characteristic sort of way of being or work of human beings to live together in conversation with one another. And he says that, unlike cattle, which sort of bump into each other when they're eating together, eating grass together, the human way of community is living together in conversation. So speech and conversation, whether it be philosophical conversation, which would be the highest kind, or the way that most normal people live, which is living out their lives and making moral choices and living in moral communities.
So, what would you say then? Because my understanding of Lewis's contention, and I think this is relatively common, I don't know that it's fair to say we suffer any more from it today. I think it's just normal for people as they're younger to have a less developed understanding of what friendship is. Say, I think that's just probably normal. He differentiates between he uses various terms, but companionship I think is one thing he says versus friendship, in that people can have fun together, but friendship is when you realize, oh, this other person sees this thing about the world that I thought only I understood or recognized, or there's something the friendship has to be about, and it can be trivial or it can be deep. It can be deeply personal, but he says that in effect that's what he's defining as friendship, is this kind of meeting of the minds or souls of a recognition of some sort of unity beyond just trivial fun together.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's part of moral development, right? I mean, children, of course, want to have fun together, and so because they're less morally developed, at least for the most part, than adults, their intellects haven't quite formed yet. So they're stages of development. So yeah, so children, seek what Aristotle would call friendships of pleasure with one another. Will you play with me? Let's go play at the park. Or these days, let's play on video games, this sort of stuff. But I mean, that's such a wonderful expression, that statement that Lewis makes, that, at a certain point in our intellectual and moral development, we meet somebody, maybe, hopefully, who sort of, you click at a deeper level. And I think that's a very important life event for people. And, hopefully it happens more than once. Where you realize, no, friendship is not simply having fun together, which it can be, but there is a kind of, Aristotle has a rare word where he describes this meeting of the minds. He calls it synesthesis, which literally means seeing together or perceiving together. And it's not simply we can both see the same physical object, right? Which in itself is a good thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we love beautiful views, but we also want to share them, right? Did you see that? Did you see that as a way of kind of connecting? But he wants to use that term also to express an intellectual perception, which I think that's what Lewis is getting at. That you see that in a way that I can see too, right? So it's a way not only of kind of validating one's own beliefs, but it's a validation that we share a common world together, and we're able to sort of see them as sort of two lenses of a binocular working simpatico together. That's exactly sort of a very important event that Aristotle identifies as part of friendship. Yeah.
And I obviously keep pulling it back to Lewis. I'll maybe end on the Lewis with this thread, is that a common refrain in his work, not just in the Four Loves, but it's certainly very present there, is a sort of notion that virtues can become vices, and that the higher the virtue rises, the lower the vice can descend. I think, as he puts it, people are not going to make a religion out of cowardice, but they would make one out of patriotism and love. And that it is possible to turn these things awry. And so you see this underlying theme throughout the entire book between erotic love, affection, and friendship. Even though he praises these things greatly and talks about their necessities and talks about them being natural and instinctual and things that ought to be developed, he also forewarns at the end of each chapter, talking about them, they can go awry, and they can actually end up being more terrible than if you had had no love in the first place. Kind of concluding that it's ultimately agape, or God's love, or the selfless, the higher love, is the only sure footing. something that we don't necessarily share. And of course, with friendship, he talks about the notion that it can ultimately be a cliquish sort of internal love that hates everything outside of the defined group. And if you multiply this enough, you end up with some of the most godless forms of fascism, right? Where it's,
Right.
yes, there's
Yeah.
plenty of air quotes love within the group, but everyone else
Yeah.
is subhuman. And so I'm asking that in the sense of, in connection with your work, what is the sense in which civic friendship, as beautiful and necessary as it is, or let me rephrase this, is it necessary, however, for there to be a higher love operating within the background for civic friendship to actually function?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think it has to. Yeah. I mean, when you were talking about Lewis, his observation owes a lot to Augustine, St. Augustine. It's very Augustinian, right? So St. Augustine, um, he loves philosophy. He loves Plato. He's one of the great church fathers who tries to teach Christians that no, philosophy is a human, God-given good. That
Very controversial at that time.
indeed, but he also is attentive to the argument, makes the argument that at that peak of human excellence that philosophy is also that moment of its greatest fall, right? So he is very attentive to the pridefulness of philosophy. And he also is very attentive to the pridefulness of friendship. He's got this moving passage in book 4, chapter 4 of the Confessions, where he talks about a friend whom he does not name, and their deep friendship and love for one another. And quite often, this is sort of seen as Augustine's sort of definitive statement on friendship, but it's actually a critique of, you might say, a certain classical understanding of friendship, which sort of sees friendship as too self-contained, too autonomous, in the sense that you identified and that Lewis identifies. So he says, and so he can kind of concludes from this, and he says, friendship is really only made possible by the Holy Spirit, which is that sort of shift from filial love to agape, from friendship to charity. Now, you could kind of get into sort of a theological question: what are the differences or similarities between friendship and charity? I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, will say that ultimately charity is a form of friendship. He wants
Right.
to sort of say it the perfection, but I think the point still stands. So if you flip it over to the civic side, I mean, even in the ancient Greeks, I mean, Aristotle has all this language that your politics, your political community is the highest good. Politics is the master or architectonic art. That the common good is divine, unlike our individual goods. But he's not totally on board with that. He says it, but he's not totally on board with that. And you really kind of see him kind of distancing himself from that when he actually does get into his discussion of friendship, because it turns out that political friendship or civic friendship or homonoia, as good as it is not the best, and in fact depends on the formation of your citizenry and leaders, of the types of friendships that are higher. I mean, Aristotle is going to point to philosophical friendships that are higher. So I think the classics and Aristotle would argue that a healthy civic friendship is healthy because it places the goods of politics in the proper place, with a recognition that there's certain moral goods that transcend the polis. And because of Christianity, and this is recognized in liberal democracies, separation of church and state, that there are certain things that are like the church, the life of faith, for example, faith communities have a moral good that is sort of higher than the moral goods that your political community embody, which is not to say that those religious goods have political authority over on top of your
Right.
government.
Right.
Right. I mean, Alexis de Tocqueville makes this wonderful comment where he says the power of religion in America, the reason why it's so powerful is because it lacks political power. Right. Its power is on souls, it's on culture. And that's how it's the most important of the institutions of democracy, right? So religion's the most important institution of democracy, but it has no political power, right? And for reasons that probably most of your viewers are pretty familiar with. So there is an example of types of friendships which a healthy liberal democratic society depends on citizens and leaders having relationships, practicing moral goods that transcend moral goods. And I think a lot of what we can owe to political polarization and the current pathologies, contentiousness in politics today, is actually because most people don't have that. Politics is the most important. Right? Maybe the loneliness crisis, such as it is, plays a role too. So where do they look for meaning? Well, they look for meaning by following social media and what social media says about what's going on in politics, right? And if that's your kind of primary form of friendship, then I think there's something lacking.
Yeah. Yeah, there is something that, I mean, it's been expressed in so many different ways that all of these broader institutions of liberty and the free market and democratic, consent, if you will, all rest on something higher, something that is unspoken, it's unenforceable in a political or legal sense. And I even think of it can't be right. I even think of Edmund Burke, who he wasn't the only one who said it this way, but he contained the view that man's purest expression of being a moral agent takes place within civic society. It is within civilization that it is formative, and we become the people we were meant to be, which is the complete antithesis, and I think he very deliberately meant it this way, against the Jacobins, against especially Rousseau, of it was actually man out in the state of nature without any constraints is the only one capable of moral formation. And you say, no, it's the precise opposite. It is civilization that literally civilizes us. But it is also civilization that is dependent upon a civil people, if you will. It's kind of reciprocal, and your point's so well taken. I don't know the numbers offhand, but it is just alarmingly sad. You can chart how many close friends a person says they have versus how politically engaged they are online. And it's almost like that capsulation that sounds like the key to almost all of our problems in Western politics these days. Is people, it's politics such a foolish outlet for the most important things in your life, shall we say?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I wouldn't want to blame social media on everything. In a lot of ways, it's a symptom, but it's certainly an accelerant.
Right.
It's certainly an accelerant. And just on there's a kind of romanticism with what Burke is that's his target, right? A political romantic does see politics as sort of this highest thing, precisely because they're unhappy with they don't want human life to be sort of carved up and divided into different pieces. Right, the romantic wants the authenticity. The romantic wants wholeness. Right, they want a kind of seamless web of existence. Right, this is all in Rousseau. Right, that's kind of his project, and they're going to be unhappy. The romantic's going to be unhappy with. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, give unto God's what is God's, which is sort of the theological underpinnings, I would say, of liberal democracy, right? You can't have separation of church and state unless you have give unto Caesar what's his and what's God's. Right. And the Romantic project rebels against that. And, may not want to bring God in as a theocrat does, but seems to want to have its God as the state. That's usually how it turns out. Yeah.
Yeah, the Romantic project is not one thing, of course. It has a lot of different variations, but I think you can see that general impulse. And of course, you have it's interesting to me because Russell Kirk in the conservative mind, as much as he critiqued the Romantics, he seemed to have far more to say against Bentham and the calculists and those who had a very cold view of reality. At least he seemed to have Marx and Rousseau and the Romantics. There was something redeemable about them. At least they were trying to reestablish some magic in the world, even if it was the wrong kind.
Well, that's why
But
John Stuart Mill had his famous breakdown, right? Because he was educated in that Benthamite, you know,
yeah,
iron cage of modernity, and then he read Coleridge,
yeah,
and sort of the marriage that came out of that was the religion of humanity and and his own form of romanticism.
yeah. It's maybe ill fitting, but I'm reminded of the G.K. Chesterton quote that is it the logician or I think it's the rationalist, he says, is trying to get the universe into his head and his head cracks. The poet just wants to get his head into the universe.
Oh
And
yeah,
I
yeah,
think
no, that's good.
there's some
That's
beauty in
good.
that. But
Yeah, that is good. Yeah.
I know I mentioned that I wanted to kind of spend half the time on friendship, and we're 75% of the way through the conversation, but and we can return to it because I think there's still some threads we haven't fully pulled on here. But I'd be remiss if I didn't spend any time, and we have talked about civics, obviously, but you have been imported here into the United States as a foreign operative, much like de Tocqueville, to do, I think, as you put it, to do the job Americans don't want to do, which is teach us civics. And I guess I want to start here, which is I don't know if it's just because I run in conservative circles. Maybe this is just a conservative obsession, but it seems like most people you talk to agree. Yeah, it'd sure be a good thing if American students were learning civics. Like that would make us better. So if there's such an appetite for it, why do we lack the funding? Why do we lack the will? Like, what is preventing us from actually teaching civics wholesale to, say, public school, high school students? And of course, you're at the collegiate level. If it seems like everybody agrees this is so direly needed.
I think because there's a lot of confusion over what teaching civics means. So yeah, I've just about 6 months into my position here. Since last August, I was brought in as the associate director and professor at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, which was started operations in spring of 2017 and was the first of now many of these kind of civic schools across the country, and many at flagship public universities. And some of the newer ones are actually larger than what we are here at ASU. So you've got the Hamilton School at Florida, University of Florida, and you've got the Civic School at University of Texas, Austin. You have at Ohio State at the 5 different campuses of Ohio State. So not just Columbus, but in Toledo and Cincinnati and elsewhere, civic schools at each of those campuses. So I'm not going to list them all, but it's a growing and largely at public institutions. But a lot of the model comes from the James Madison Institute at Princeton that was created by and run by Robert George. Stanford has one, Tufts University has one, to address exactly this question that you posed, which is, why is there a gap in our civic knowledge? Why is there a gap in civic literacy? And from what I've seen so far, these civic schools have their job cut out for them. There's not much civic literacy, and I think a lot of it is not really appreciating like the culture, sort of cultural statement about the culture. A lack of appreciation of what exactly that means. So as far as I can tell, a lot of civic education in America takes the form of, knowing how to sign a petition or teaching kids to protest something. And as soon as you kind of teach kids to protest something, then the partisanship of the teacher comes into question. Then it becomes rather controversial. And so what these civic schools, as part of their mandate, has been to try to educate students not so much of how to sign a petition or how to form a protest, But you need the kind of proper knowledge of first principles of American constitutionalism, a sense of knowledge of American political constitutional history to kind of understand what this country's about. And if you lack that, then teaching kids how to protest is not going to really help you that much, because they're going to act, but they're not going to do it with any understanding of why they're acting. So the attempt is to try to educate kids to become more knowledgeable about their regime, so they can make better informed decisions in their lives as citizens, and to have a stronger sense of what citizenship entails. So here at SCETL, that's just kind of the acronym, here at the Civic School at ASU, we've got our major of civic thought and leadership, and you can take classes on American constitutionalism, you can take classes on Plato, you can take classes on Abraham Lincoln, sort of all with an eye on this question of what does it mean to be a good human being and a good citizen. We're rolling out different majors, so we've got a plan to have a major in American constitutionalism, which kind of really focuses on sort of American founding principles, constitutional law, and not just case law, but understanding the broader what a constitution does. We've got a PPE major that looks like it's going to get accepted. It's going to start in the fall. So philosophy, economics, and politics. And then our fourth strand, which will become a major, not yet, but probably in 2 years from now, will be war and strategy. So, which will serve a lot of our military members of the ASU community. There's lots of ROTC, there's lots of military students, but of course these war and strategy classes would also be open to civilians.
This is all welcome news, of course, for one who believes that the long-term solution of the problems with higher education, of course, is going to have to probably be gradual and systematic and thought through and done in let's say, test cases or more beta forms throughout the United States to see what does or doesn't work. But as you're speaking, I'm just curious, like if Saul Alinsky, say, the dude that wrote Rules for Radicals, who inspired Hillary Clinton, I guess Barack Obama in a sense, I won't say the radical left, but the comfortable, and certainly within their younger days, comfortable with radical left Democrats. If he were in charge of, let's say, civics education in the United States, and granted, he's not going to be because he's dead, but had he been, if you're alive today and in charge, I think he'd be quite happy if what is being produced is largely individuals who know how to sign petitions and start protests. Even though he, in all fairness, fancied himself a Madisonian, he didn't reject the American project, but he saw within it the need for kind of a, I won't be uncharitable to just say straight up might makes right, but kind of a notion that, America, that American democracy makes possible these sort of power dynamics. And so therefore the people, the have-nots, as he would call them, have the responsibility and duty to take it upon themselves to basically make life miserable for the haves until they get their share. This sounds worlds apart to me from the way you're describing civics. And so I'm curious how much of it, because you mentioned, University of Austin, Arizona State, Florida. These are not exactly the Berkeleys in the higher collegiate, and I'm sure there's plenty of progressives. But how much of this is also an issue of this is an obsession or a project of the more conservative-minded? But when you get into the Ivy Leagues, where they're far more concerned with, say, critical race theory or the latest, critical theories, if you will, they would say that sounds like a lot of drivel, a lot of nonsense. We don't have time for that. Is this a left versus right fight? Or do you have your fellow brothers and sisters on the left who say, no, we do need a proper understanding of Lincoln and the founders, even if we disagree with them?
It tries to be bipartisan. I think it's less left versus right as opposed to a lot of these topics just have stopped getting taught. Right. So it's actually hard to find kind of a left-wing progressive academic who really thinks that, you need to teach George Washington or you need to teach Lincoln. And so there's a kind of lack of interest in a lot of ways from the progressive left in American founding principles. I'm not going to say that you won't find any. I mean, there's kind of leftist scholars of Madison and the founding, and they do their work, but it doesn't always get translated into university curriculum. And like a way that this gets played out is if you compare Skedel offers a lot of courses that are what we call in the business service courses. So we have our majors, of course, but most of our registrations are, STEM students, business students, students from other faculties who need to fulfill their mostly humanities requirements. There's a kind of whole list that they have to fill before they can graduate. And most of our classes are humanities, and some of them are state mandated American institution requirements that all students have to take. So as a result, our second year American constitutionalism class is filled to the brim with students from other faculties because they have to fulfill the AMIT requirement, American institutions. Well, we're not the only faculty that offers AMIT credits. Other majors, other departments have it, but if you kind of look at what gets passed and gets on the list, it's not really clear why they're there. What does that have to do with American institutions? Mm-hmm. And of course, the people who come up with these lists are drawn from other parts of the university, which are exactly the sort of, mindset that, the Arizona State Legislature, kind of wanted to go after in some ways when they created Skedel. So a lot of it is, there's a kind of left and right dynamic, but I think the more salient is actually trying to get a curriculum that looks at political history, that looks like diplomatic history, military history, looks at political theory, looks at not just case law to send students off to law school, but to have an understanding of how American constitutionalism operates within a Madisonian framework, within separation of powers. So there's a kind of effort to bring more first principles into the conversation. So it's partly, I think that more salient divide is a kind of curricular one.
I'm struck by Yuval Levin in his book, American Covenant, talks about, these are not his exact words, but I think the concept is there that if the Constitution is literally we the people, right? If it is our Constitution, it can't just be the prerogative and the interest of the lawyer class. It has to somehow be something that is of interest, even if we can't speak about it at maybe the depth or complexity lawyers can. And to be frank, I would argue there are aspects of constitutional thought that I think an average American may be better at grasping than a lawyer, because it's not just a legal document. But I'm asking, let me ask this as the closing question here, because I remember all the way back to the 90s, we were told, well, the problem with universities is all those radical hippies of the 1960s grew up and become college professors. And that may very well be true, but good grief, at this point, what are they in their 70s, 80s, 90s? At some point, it's, there may need to be another explanation. But it does, in fact, seem that, the faculty, the administration, there's sort of a stranglehold there. And even if there's a willingness, say, to allow or justify civic teaching, then maybe there's a misunderstanding or misappreciation as to what that would mean. But I want to reverse this and ask, this is a podcast chiefly for millennials. We are not the young Americans anymore. You're presumably students or Gen Z, soon to be Gen Alpha. What is the general appetite or interest among the students? I mean, I know, there are a lot of their, as you mentioned, your classes are going to be full for those that they have to go to. But is there a hunger and a yearning among Americans to say, well, I actually want to know, what does it mean to live in a Madisonian republic? Why is Lincoln important? What makes our nation different from others? Are you seeing a hunger and appetite for that among the young? Are you seeing that maybe they're disinterested, but as you progress in a class, the light bulb comes on? Or is it completely hopeless and they're just more interested in having fun and graduating?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question lies not so much by gauging the views of university students and especially freshmen, but looking at the rise of classical schools, K to 12 in America, and they're just going gangbusters. And a lot of that is driven by parent demand because there's fairly widespread disillusionments with the way the public system's operating. But one of the things that drives demand for classical education, there's a lot of charter schools here in the Valley in Phoenix, is that they seem to offer a more robust, both academic and moral education, which is integrated into a kind of a civic framework. And it seems to be quite successful. So when those graduates of those classical schools come to ASU and quite often come to Skedal, they're gung-ho. They want to learn this stuff. The students who are coming out of the public schools are kind of at a disadvantage because they haven't really gotten much. And so they're kind of like blank pieces of paper. And so either they'll respond positively, the lights will come on, or they'll find it too much. And sometimes they take a little bit longer, or maybe they never come around. But I think there is a growing recognition amongst the American public that some kind of civic and better moral and education is needed. And I think you can probably see that in the rise of classical charter schools. Probably that's the most vivid piece of evidence you can see. And how that affects future universities will remains to be seen. But I mean, I know Skedal, certainly we do some recruiting in the classical schools, and we've got a really good relationship with them. They like what we do.
Interesting. Yeah, I appreciate you drawing it back further than college, because you're right. Really, that formation does have to begin at a much younger level.
And when I was giving my spiel, my sales pitch of Skedal a few moments ago, I neglected to mention that part of our mandate is actually K-12 civic education. And so we've got faculty who are involved with the reform of civic education in the state of Arizona, and they do a lot of outreach work, PD work with teachers, but also running events and seminars with usually high school students. So it's not just universities. You got to start younger.
Well, I am longing for the day when we don't have to import foreigners to do the job of civics education. But until that day comes, John, I'm very grateful that there are people like you out there doing this. And John von Heyking, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, and I love being in America. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.